China is ascending to become the world's undisputed high-tech superpower, but its current state is a far cry from where the nation began. To the modern eye, China seems like an immovable force, but it wasn't always like this. And to understand modern China, we have to look at the fire it was forged in. At its peak, ancient China stretched over 13 million square kilometers, making it the fourth largest land empire in history. But almost 2 centuries ago, it began a rapid decline. Foreign powers, wars, famines, natural disasters, and even drugs tore the empire apart, causing over 100 million deaths, loss of over 26% of its territory, and the desertification of over a quarter of the remaining land. How did this happen? And how did it recover to become the world's superpower it is today? This story kicks off in the 1500s, when the Portuguese first showed up, and before long the rest of the West was knocking on China's door too. By the 1700s, the world was basically obsessed with everything China had to offer: silk, tea, porcelain, you name it. But China held all the cards. They traded those luxuries for literal piles of silver, effectively vacuuming up the West's wealth. But the British found a way to flip the table. They began smuggling in a new commodity with high returns: opium. It was an old-school Chinese medicine, but the British started smuggling it in as a recreational drug, hooking millions of people in the process. This wasn't just a health crisis. It was a century-long, slow burn that systematically stripped the rulers, the Qing dynasty, of its power. Emperors tried to pull the plug 4 different times, banning the drug outright, but the smugglers just ignored them. Finally, in 1834, the current emperor had had enough. He seized and torched 1,300 tons of opium right on the docks. But the British didn't just walk away. They fired back with a fleet that absolutely steamrolled the Qing army. The peace deal that followed, the Treaty of Nanking, was basically a shakedown. The Qing were forced to cough up $21 million, $830 million US today, surrender 5 major ports like Shanghai, and give British citizens a get-out-of-jail-free card from Chinese laws. Oh, they had to hand over Hong Kong too. This wasn't just a defeat. It was the fuse for 100 years of national nightmare known as the Century of Humiliation. While foreign powers poked at the edges, a man named Hong Xiuquan tore the country apart from the inside. He claimed to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ and started a Christian movement to destroy the demons of the Qing dynasty. He gathered an army of millions, promising a heavenly kingdom. What followed was one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history, with a death toll that dwarfed World War I. It lasted 14 years, killing 20 to 30 million people, and left the empire's heartland in ruins. With the Qing dynasty already on the ropes, the West smelled blood in the water. In 1856, the British kicked off the Second Opium War, and this time they brought friends. France, Russia, and the US all wanted a piece of the action. By the time the dust settled, China was forced to fully legalize the very drug that was destroying it and open even more ports to foreign control. This is where the story goes from bad to apocalyptic. You've got the foreign powers breathing down their necks, but inside the borders, the country was literally starving and bleeding out. The Qing dynasty was effectively a puppet in its own palace, but as the old saying goes, misfortunes never come alone. While the 8-nation alliance was busy carving up Chinese territory, the land itself seemed to turn on the people. Between the 1850s and the 1870s, a series of brutal uprisings like the Taiping Rebellion, Taiping Rebellion, the Dungan Revolt, and the Boxer Rebellion left tens of millions dead. Then came the famines. The Northern Chinese Famine, 1876 to 1879, with up to 13 million deaths. That is roughly equivalent to the entire population of New York City and Los Angeles, combined being wiped off the map in just 3 years. The 1906 famine, the high-end estimate of 25 million deaths, is nearly equal to the total population of Australia today. Imagine an entire continent going silent. At this point, we aren't just talking about political failure. We're talking about a humanitarian catastrophe of a scale the world had rarely seen. The mandate of heaven wasn't just slipping, it was gone. In 1911, the Xinhai Revolution finally toppled the last emperor, but there was no central power to catch the fall. China splintered into the warlord era, where local generals fought for dominance while millions died of famine and war. Out of this absolute chaos, two very different visions for China's future began to take shape. You had the nationalists, KMT, who wanted a modern republic, and the communists, CCP, who were looking to the Soviet model. At first, these two groups actually played nice. They formed an alliance to take down the warlords and finally stitch the country back together. It worked, mostly, but it was a marriage of convenience that was never going to last. In 1927, the nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, decided they'd had enough of their partners. They launched a brutal purge known as the Shanghai Massacre, killing thousands of communist Ts in the streets. This wasn't just a political split, it was the start of one of the longest and bloodiest civil wars in history. For the next decade, while the rest of the world was dealing with the Great Depression, China was tearing itself apart from the inside. But just as the nationalists and communists were locked in this fight to the death, a much bigger shadow was looming. To the east, the Empire of Japan was watching. They saw a China divided, bleeding, and weak. And in 1931, they decided it was time to move in. The Japanese invasion devastated the land. While the KMT fought conventional battles, the CCP, led by Mao Zedong, used guerrilla warfare. The Chinese military was beaten bloody. Giving up overt resistance, they switched to covert actions to outlast the Japanese until help arrived. And by the time the war ended, 20 million more Chinese were dead. You'd believe that after over a century of turmoil, China would finally settle down. However, there was one final problem left. Who will lead China in the future? The KMT came out of World War II looking like the winners on paper. They had American weapons and international recognition, but they were exhausted, and their economy was in freefall due to hyperinflation. On the other hand, the CCP had spent the war years organizing the peasantry. They weren't just a military anymore, they were a movement. The civil war restarted with a vengeance, but the momentum had shifted. Within 3 years, the CCP's People's Liberation Army swept across the country. By 1949, the KMT's leadership fled to Taiwan, and Mao Zedong stood at the gates of the Forbidden City in Beijing to declare the birth of the People's Republic of China. The Century of Humiliation was officially over, but the cost was staggering. Look at the state of the nation Mao inherited. Infrastructure, virtually non-existent. Rail lines were blown up and factories were stripped bare. Economy, the currency was worthless. People were back to bartering with grain and cloth. Society, a population of 540 million people, most of whom were illiterate and living in extreme poverty. China had finally stood up, but standing up was the easy part. Now they had to figure out how to feed 500 million people and transform a broken agrarian society into a global power. This was the darkest irony of the new era. The party that had risen to power promising to end the Century of Humiliation ended up overseeing a self-inflicted catastrophe. The logic behind the Great Leap Forward from 1958 to 1962 was simple but deadly. Mao wanted to bypass decades of development and turn China into an industrial powerhouse overnight. Farmers were ordered to stop farming and melt down their tools and pots to make steel. The result was useless scrap metal and empty fields. To please the leadership, local officials lied about record-breaking harvests. The government then took what little food existed as surplus, leaving the peasants with nothing. The death toll, up to 45 million, is a number so large it's hard to process. That is roughly the entire population of modern-day Spain simply vanishing in 48 months. But the country was not allowed to catch its breath. Mao launched the Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 1976. This wasn't about the economy, it was about the soul of the nation. Mao mobilized the youth to hunt down class enemies. They became the Red Guards. Students turned on their teachers, children turned on their parents. Mao targeted the four olds, anything representing old customs, old culture, old habits or old ideas were targeted. Ancient temples were smashed, priceless artifacts were burned, and the intellectual heart of China was gutted. For over 100 years, China endured tremendous chaos. The scale of loss that China endured between the mid-19th century and the late 20th century is almost impossible to comprehend. When you add up the casualties from foreign invasions, civil wars, and state-led economic failures, The total death toll ranges between 109 to 171 million people. To put this into perspective, the high-end estimate of 171 million is more than the current total population of the United Kingdom, France, and Canada combined. In 1976, Mao was dead and China was exhausted. The country was isolated, poor, and traumatized. Despite the faults of the previous era, there was a collective hunger for a better future. The question wasn't just if China would change, but who would lead it. Enter Deng Xiaoping, a short, pragmatic man who stepped out of the shadows with a radical idea. It didn't matter if a cat was black or white, as long as it caught mice. Deng Xiaoping was a survivor. He had been purged and persecuted during the Cultural Revolution, but he outmaneuvered his rivals to take center stage in 1978. His first move? Stop the chaos. He ended the Cultural Revolution and began rehabilitating those the previous regime had cast out. Then came the mantra that changed everything: to be rich is glorious. Deng moved away from rigid central planning toward what we now call a socialist market economy. He did three things that seemed impossible at the time: decentralized the economy, giving power back to local regions. Opening the door, he invited foreign capital and investment for the first time. He created special economic zones. Cities like Shenzhen were transformed from fishing villages into global manufacturing hubs almost overnight. It wasn't just about the money. To support this growth, China underwent a massive social overhaul. A 9-year compulsory education system was established to create a literate, skilled workforce. A massive push for tech self-sufficiency began. And the one-child policy, a controversial and strict measure introduced to curb population growth and ensure resources could keep up with the economy. By the time Deng had died, he had fundamentally recoded the DNA of the country. Even after his death, his successors didn't blink. They followed his roadmap to the letter. The late 90s and early 2000s were China's coming out party. 1997, Hong Kong was returned to China, marking the end of British colonial rule. 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization. It integrated China into the global supply chain, making it the world's factory. 2008, the Beijing Olympics. For the first time, the world saw a modern, high-tech and confident China step onto the global stage. And since 2012, under the leadership of Xi Jinping, the narrative has shifted again. We are now in the era of the Chinese dream. China is no longer just trying to catch up, it's trying to lead. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, China is investing in infrastructure across the globe, from Africa to Europe, asserting itself as a geopolitical heavyweight. Today, China stands as the world's second-largest economy, having moved from one of the poorest nations on Earth to an upper-middle-income superpower. Whether you view China's rise with awe or apprehension, one thing is undeniable. The reforms started in 1978 represent one of the fastest economic transformations in human history. The general architect Deng Xiaoping set a ball in motion that hasn't stopped rolling since. If you want to learn more about China and its changes today, hit that subscribe button.